5 members of the primary healthcare team are assembled for their weekly 8 a.m. meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to develop a plan of action for the clients. Present are Susan Knight, the psychologist, Terry White, the registered nurse, Nancy Furlong, the social worker, and Kathy Kane, the family physician. Simon Wilson, the pharmacist, will arrive shortly.
Good morning. Well, everybody's here except Simon, and we really do have to get started. It's already 8:10, and I have to be out of here by 9 o'clock. The first case we're going to do today is Mrs. Hines, a 78-year-old woman who's just come to the clinic for an evaluation. Dr. Kane, would you please present the case?
Thanks for getting us started. I met with Mrs. Hines and her daughter-in-law last week. The daughter-in-law states that Mrs. Hines' memory has been getting worse over the past couple of months. She further reports that her mother-in-law has been having difficulty remembering to take all of her medications. Sometimes she comes home to find Mrs. Hines' noontime pills on the kitchen counter in the afternoon. Mrs. Hines insists this has only happened once, but she does admit that it's been difficult to adjust. She moved a few months ago, and she says she just doesn't feel she's established a comfortable routine yet.
Sorry, folks. I stopped at the cafeteria to get coffee. I just can't function this early without my caffeine. I brought an extra one because I'm sure one of you needs coffee. Any takers?
Okay, everybody, let's settle down. Dr. Kane, could you please continue?
Mrs. Hines has been taking digoxin for 10 years after an episode of AFib with CHF. She also has a history of hypertension. She seems to have been diagnosed as having hypothyroidism at some time in the past because she's taking thyroxin. Her other meds include a laxative, a sleeping pill, and NSAID for osteoarthritis. Susan, you also saw Mrs. Hines. What were the results of the mental status exams?
Just a sec here. Yes, here's Ms. Hines' record. On examination, her MMSE score was 22. She knew the date, but she couldn't remember objects, and she didn't do simple math calculations. Her geriatric depression score was 9, which is just below the borderline.
Her physical exam, including a neurological, was unremarkable except for some mild edema in her feet. However, I think this lady could use a psych consult.
Why don't you think I'm able to handle the mental status issues in this case?
Sorry, Susan. I'm just saying that this lady's psychiatric condition needs to be assessed further.
Well, I think I've got a pretty good handle on the case. I've also interviewed Mrs. Hines, and I understand the family systems issues. I'm concerned, however, about the depression of Mrs. Hines. She appeared to be very tearful and complained about not having as much energy as she used to. I've also learned that the son has started to drink heavily again, and now the daughter-in-law is very concerned that she's going to become the primary caregiver for both the husband and Mrs. Hines. Mrs. Hines was widowed around 10 years ago, and she has 3 children and lives in an apartment with the son and the daughter-in-law. She moved in from Capelin Cove, and there she lived alone in a small house. She would prefer that now, but doesn't think that she can handle it financially. The son and the daughter-in-law convinced her to move in with them after she fell last winter on the ice and sustained a Colles fracture. She can do most ADLs, but some trouble with bathing. She complains that her son's tub in the apartment is quite small. She's a devout Catholic and really wants to light candles in her husband's memory. However, the son and the daughter-in-law don't want her to because they're afraid of fire, and she's become so forgetful lately. She is upset with this and, of course, demands to be taken to a priest to seek solace, but so far I don't believe she's gone.
I'm concerned about her fatigue, Kathy. What about her thyroid management?
Sorry, I have to take this. I'll be back in a minute.
Nancy, Mrs. Hines might benefit from a visit with a priest?
Yes, I have thought of that, and I did contact her local parish. They promised me they should send somebody over there in the next couple of weeks.
Thyroxine. You know thyroxine needs to be carefully monitored.
Sorry for the interruption. Where was I? Oh yes, Susan's question about the thyroxine management. We need to run some tests to find out what's wrong. It's probably just hypothyroidism, and she needs to have her thyroxine adjusted. There was an interesting article in CMAJ which recently talked about the underdiagnosis of hypothyroidism and the failure to do the appropriate tests. I'll have to dig it out and get everybody a copy.
Dr. Kane, why don't I, organize a care plan for Mrs. Hines?
Okay, great.
Okay.
You're ending already. Well, I'd like to make my contribution. Remember, start low and go slow.